The expanding X series from Pivotal Pedalboards makes it possible to design versatile yet compact builds for touring, studio, or home use. In this video, we'll walk through a complete in-house build for a local client, from the initial request to a finished, organized, ready-to-play board. Many of these steps will be helpful for anyone considering their own build with an X series pedalboard, from choosing the right size board to layout and wiring tips. First, we of course need to know which pedals the client wants to include in the build. The client's current board was already full, however they also wanted to add a large Plethora X3 pedal, be able to occasionally connect to an H9, and add a compact loop switcher with MIDI control. They were hoping everything might fit on an X14, which would give him an even smaller footprint than his current board, even with all of these new additions. We highly recommend Pedal Playground for anyone wondering what size pedalboard will work best with your pedals. If you're not familiar, it allows you to choose pedalboards from various manufacturers and put together a virtual pedalboard. We'll load our X14 base as well as the X14 upper. Although they'll stack above each other in reality, it's easier to arrange pedals with them separate. Next, we'll search for all the pedals we want to include in the build. There are thousands in the directory, but if you can't find something, you can also create custom pedals, which is what we've done here with a custom 2-button switch. Now we'll see if everything fits. We like to place the switcher and power supplies first. In this build, we'd like to mount the Chox 4 power supply vertically on the back wall to save some space, which means it will only take up an inch of space in the base, but since this is a top-down view, we'll just place it like this, sticking it into the base roughly 1 inch. With some careful planning, the Chox DC7 can be placed under the top deck. Power supplies that are 1 inch thick or less will leave enough space below them so standard height pedals can still be placed in the base. We'll place the Plethora and Protein on the front row for easy access to their foot switches, while the other pedals can be placed anywhere since everything can be bypassed through the switcher. The biggest mistake we always see people making when planning their pedal layouts is placing pedals too close to each other without leaving room for jacks and cable routing. Plugs for MIDI, USB, and XLR usually demand even more space, so plan accordingly. In the base of the board, behind the switcher, we'll place the client's Morning Glory since it's being used as an always-on pedal. We'll leave 1.5 to 2 inches of room beside it for cable bundles running from the switcher to the upper deck. The back right corner will be used for our patch bay, and the back left corner is left open for additional MIDI, USB, and DC power jacks in our AUX3 panel. Now that we've confirmed everything should fit on this size pedalboard, we're ready to proceed with the build. Now that we have the X14 and the client's pedals on site, the first thing we've done is lay everything out in the arrangement we had planned in Pedal Playground. You'll notice that the 1/4 inch cable ends are all plugged into the pedals to make sure everything will have enough room once cabled up. The one thing we did change in the arrangement was to reverse the position of the Univibe and the Memory Man, which will give more space to the DC jack, which is on the side of the Univibe. We've also plugged in our MIDI cables on the Plethora, since we want to identify any tight spacing issues during this rough fit before we start soldering any cables. Moving to the base, we've plugged in the other ends of the MIDI cables to the switcher and the external MIDI send to check our spacing. We've also plugged in our USB cable. We'll tidy up this area later in the build. The 1/4 inch plugs are in place in the back of the switcher with plenty of room, as well as the plugs in the JHS Morning Glory, and all of the plugs in the IO6 patch bay, which will handle all of the 1/4 inch ins and outs. There's also a plug in the back of a custom 2-button switch we built for the client, which provides extra control for the switcher, including on-off indicator LEDs. As mentioned earlier, we're using compact Chox power supplies for this build, mounted to the underside of the deck as well as the back wall of the pedalboard. Again, we've plugged in our cables to make sure everything has room. A couple spaces have been intentionally left empty. There's room along the back between the hinges for the Chox 4, which is mounted to the back wall and uses this space when the X14 closes into its travel position and the back wall becomes vertical. There's also space behind the right corner of the switcher, where we'll be sending our bundles of cable up to the pedals on the upper deck. To test out our cable routing setup, we always recommend wrapping up some of your bulk cable to create simulated cable bundles. In this case, we'll have 8 pedals up top, requiring 16 cables total, which we've split up into 2 bundles of 8 cables each. The cables will run out of the back of the switcher and will get anchored to the base with our supplied adjustable cable straps, approximately 4.5 to 5 inches from the back of the base. We normally recommend anchoring the bundles to the top deck 4.5 to 5 inches up from the base. However, in this case, when we simulated how the bundles will move when closing the board, we notice the bundle competing for space with the hinge, so we're going to use an alternate mounting orientation. By anchoring the bundles lower and pointing them down towards the back of the top deck, the slack in the bundles will move to the side when the deck is drawn forward into the travel position. This will leave plenty of space between the cables and the hinge. Here are the two orientations shown together for comparison, the left one with the cables held higher and pointing up towards the front of the deck, and the right one placed lower and pointing down towards the bottom of the deck. Each orientation will slack up a bit differently, so use the one which best suits your layout. We've now mounted our anchor points and tidied up our other cables from earlier so we know exactly how much space we'll have to route our signal cables from the two bundles. The bundle on the right will travel through its upper anchor point, and then all of its cables will immediately travel up around the back channel of the upper deck and connect to the 4 nearest pedals. The bundle on the left will pass 4 of its cables up around the back channel of the deck and connect to the MXR Univibe and JHS Clover. The other 4 cables in the bundle will loop back immediately and run underneath the deck before jumping up and connecting to the 2 front pedals. We're nearly ready to start running cables, so it's time to quickly review our signal paths in and out of the switcher along with our plug requirements. We'll be using straight plugs in the back of the switcher and 90s everywhere else. We'll be running the signal path in mono, however we'll also use some TRS cables when required. First, the guitar signal will enter from our input on the IO6 and pass into the switcher. In the first loop, we have our fuzz pedal, requiring a send and a return cable, each with one straight end and one 90-degree end. Loop 2 will be the Univibe, and Loop 3 will be the Ego compressor, each with the same cable requirements as Loop 1. With this switcher, Loops 4, 5, and 6 are stereo loops, which can each be split into separate mono loops by programming the unit accordingly. When this is done, the tip of the TRS jack feeds Loop 4, and the ring will feed Loop 7. The cable is wired just like an insert cable, with one straight TRS dual mono type end for the switcher and 2 90-degree TS ends for the pedals. One insert cable will handle the sends to both pedals, and another insert cable will handle the returns. The tumnus will be in Loop 4, and the clover will be in Loop 7. Similarly, the protein will be in Loop 5, and the plethora in Loop 8, the morning glory in Loop 6, and the memory man in Loop 9. With this switcher, the loops can be reordered per patch, but we still want to start with a logical pedal order by default. Next, the insert loop will simply be a send and return cable to the patch bay, so an external pedal can be added to the signal chain at any time. In this case, the client has an H9 they use occasionally, but any pedal can be auditioned here and powered by external DC power jacks, which we've installed on both sides of the board. A single TRS cable will run to the patch bay so an expression pedal can be used beside the board. Another TRS cable will connect to the custom 2-button extension switch. Finally, a single cable will send the out signal to the patch bay. Listing everything in this way helps keep us organized during the build and gives us a list of all the components we may need to order. The shorter cables running between the switcher and the patch bay have been soldered, labeled, and installed first. Next, we'll start pulling cable for our loops. Starting with Loop 1, we'll run cable from the pedal location on the top deck, down through the anchors along the planned path, and to the switcher, where we'll give it a temporary label with the loop number, pedal name, and send or return. We'll also put a temporary label on the pedal end with loop number, pedal name, and in or out. We'll follow the same process for loops 2 and 3. For any stereo to dual mono loops, measure the length of dual mono cable out to the furthest pedal of the pair. For example, here we have the tumnus and the clover sharing a jack in the switcher. The cable path to the clover is longer, so run the cable there first. Label at the switcher end and then cut to a generous length. The pedal end doesn't need labeled yet since we still need to split the cable into its 2 paths. In this case, the pedals are in different bundles, so the strands will separate almost immediately after leaving the switcher and pass through separate anchor points as we planned previously. With Mogami 2528 cable, one of the strands will be labeled with a white line. Our method is to always use that strand for the higher loop number. This helps to keep track of the individual strands when routing and soldering. Once both strands have been run up to the top deck, we'll attach a label on both pedal ends of the cable. That was for loops 4 and 7, so we'll repeat the rough-in process for the other shared loops of 5 and 8 and 6 and 9. Now, all the straight cable ends at the switcher are ready to be soldered. With all our straight plugs soldered, labeled, and inserted into the switcher, we've tucked everything into place and pushed back the slack towards the pedals, tightening our adjustable cable straps along the way. We've also put some temporary cable wraps around the bundles to keep them organized. Next, we'll check the tension on the bundles at the upper anchor when the deck is lowered down. If the bundles tighten up too much, either adjust the position of the anchor or loosen it and add extra slack back into the bundles. Next, with the deck folded down, we'll move the deck forward and confirm that everything behaves properly. In this build, you can see that the slack avoids the hinge as planned and has room beside the Chox 4 power supply on the back wall. Now that we're happy with the bundles, each free cable end can be cut to length at the pedal and soldered with its 90-degree plug. A bit of extra cable length at this end can be useful if you choose to swap a pedal in the future. With all our cables now soldered and in place, the final step is tidying up and securing everything with a few more ties and anchors. Clear and detailed labels on your cabling will make future changes and troubleshooting much easier. We've also labeled the buttons on the switcher according to their pedal or function. A clearly labeled patch bay also makes setup easy and fast. Here we have a guitar in, an amp out, a send and return cable for our audition loop, as well as an expression pedal. The H9 receives a MIDI send signal, DC power, and cables from the audition loop. Like most switchers, we have a preset mode to switch between patches, as well as a loop mode to control pedals individually. We've also programmed a separate page to control the plethora. We can bank up or down, we can cycle through presets, and adjust parameters on the fly with the expression pedal. Similarly, we've also created a dedicated page to control the H9, allowing for quick selection of different presets. This board is ready to pack up and head to its new home. Hopefully this walkthrough helps with your own pedalboard planning. More info about our X-Series pedalboards can be found at pivotalpedalboards.com.